In 1792, Mary Wollstonecraft published what would become one of the most incendiary texts of the Enlightenment era. A Vindication of the Rights of Women wasn't written in an academic vacuum. It was a direct response to the political upheaval sweeping through Europe and the glaring contradictions she witnessed in revolutionary thought. This wasn't a timid plea for incremental reform. It was a full throated demand that the principles of the Enlightenment be applied consistently, that reason and natural rights extend to women as fully as to men. Just 3 years earlier, the French Revolution had promised liberty, equality, and fraternity. Philosophers and politicians were declaring the natural rights of man, drafting constitutions, reimagining society from the ground up. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen proclaimed that all men are born free and equal in rights, that sovereignty resides in the people, that no one should be persecuted for their opinions. Revolutionary fervor had swept away centuries of tradition in the name of reason and natural law. But Wollstonecraft noticed something troubling. These grand pronouncements about human dignity and rational autonomy somehow never extended to half the population. Women were conspicuously absent from this new vision of enlightenment, and this vision of enlightened citizenship excluded from the very rights being declared universal. The immediate catalyst for her work was Charles Maurice de Talleyrand and his report to the French National Assembly on public education in 1791. Talleyrand had proposed an ambitious education system that would prepare boys for citizenship, train them in reason and civic virtue, equip them to participate in the new democratic order, but for girls, their education would be purely domestic, designed to make them pleasing companions and competent household managers. They would be withdrawn from public schools at age 8 to be trained privately in the arts of femininity. This wasn't unusual for the time, it was standard practice across Europe, but it crystallized everything Wollstonecraft found intellectually dishonest about Enlightenment thought. Here were men claiming to build a rational society based on natural rights, yet arbitrarily excluding women from the very education that could develop their rational capacities. Wollstonecraft had already established herself as a serious thinker with her earlier work, A Vindication of the Rights of Men, published in 1790 as a response to Burke's reflections on the revolution in France. Burke had defended tradition, hierarchy, and inherited privilege, arguing that the revolutionaries were dangerous radicals destroying a delicate social order. Wollstonecraft had dismantled his arguments, defending the revolution and exposing what she saw as Burke's sentimental attachment to aristocratic power. But this new project was more personal and more radical. She was writing at a moment when the social order was genuinely up for debate, when fundamental assumptions about hierarchy and power were being questioned. And she seized that moment to ask, if education and environment shape human character, as Enlightenment thinkers claimed, then weren't women's apparent weaknesses simply the result of their systematic exclusion from proper education? Her argument wasn't that women were already equal to men in their current state. She was brutally honest about what she saw as women's frivolity, vanity, and intellectual weaknesses. She didn't romanticize or sentimentalize women, but she traced these failures directly to their education and social conditioning, to a system that deliberately cultivated weakness and dependence. In her dedication to Talleyrand, she writes, contending for the rights of woman, my main argument is built on this simple principle that if she be not prepared by education to become the companion of man, she will stop the progress of knowledge and virtue, for truth must be common to all, or it will be inefficacious with respect to its influence on general practice. And how can woman be expected to cooperate unless she know why she ought to be righteous and virtuous, unless freedom strengthen her reason till she comprehend her duty and see in what manner it is connected with her real good? If children are to be educated to understand the true principle of patriotism, their mother must be a patriot, and the love of mankind, from which an orderly train of virtues spring, can only be produced by considering the moral and civil interest of mankind. But the education and situation of women at present shuts her out from such investigations. This passage reveals Wollstonecraft's strategic approach. She's not just making a moral argument about women's rights, she's warning that society itself cannot progress at if half its population remains in ignorance. It's a pragmatic appeal wrapped in Enlightenment language about virtue and reason. If mothers are to raise patriotic, virtuous citizens, they must themselves be educated in civic virtue. If women are to cooperate in building a rational society, they must understand the principles on which it's based. You cannot have an enlightened republic built on the foundation of deliberately ignorant mothers and wives. Wollstonecraft was also writing against the dominant educational philosophy of her time, particularly Jean Jacques Rousseau's Emile, or On Education, published in 1762. Rousseau, despite being a hero of progressive thought, a defender of natural rights and popular sovereignty, had explicitly argued that women should be educated solely to please men and manage households. His fictional character Sophie, the ideal woman raised to be Emily's wife, was trained in submission and femininity, and her education designed to make her an agreeable companion rather than a thinking individual. Rousseau wrote in Emily, thus, the whole education of women ought to be relative to men, to please them, to be useful to them, to make themselves loved and honored by them, to educate them when young, to care for them when grown, to counsel them, to console them, and to make life agreeable and sweet to them. These are the duties of women at all times and should be taught them from their infancy. Wollstonecraft found this philosophy not just wrong but dangerous. It turned women into artificial beings, stunted in their development, unable to be proper mothers, wives, or citizens. Rousseau's own words condemn him in her eyes. She would later quote him extensively in her text, holding up his ideas about Sophie as the perfect example of how even enlightened thinkers perpetuated women's subordination. The man who wrote so eloquently about natural freedom and human dignity also wrote that women are made to submit, that they should be trained from infancy to bear injustice without complaint, that their reason should be developed only enough to help them obey men more perfectly. She opens her introduction with remarkable directedness, setting out both her method and her conclusion. She says, after considering the historic page and viewing the living world with anxious solicitude, the most melancholy emotions of sorrowful indignation have depressed my spirits, and I have sighed when obliged to confess that either nature has made a great difference between man and man, or that the civilization which has hitherto taken place in the world has been very partial. I have turned over various books written on the subject of education and patiently observed the conduct of parents and the management of schools, but what has been the result? A profound conviction that the neglected education of my fellow creatures is the grand source of the misery I deplore, and that women in particular are rendered weak and wretched by a variety of concurring causes, originating from one hasty conclusion. The conduct and manners of women, in fact, evidently prove that their minds are not in a healthy state, for, like the flowers which are planted in too rich a soil, strength and usefulness are sacrificed to beauty, and the flaunting leaves, after having pleased a fastidious eye, fade disregarded on the stalk long before the season when they ought to have arrived at maturity. Notice her method here. She begins with observation, not abstract theory. She's looked at history, at contemporary society, at educational texts, at real families and schools, and from this empirical foundation she draws her conclusion that women's condition is not natural but constructed through neglected education. The metaphor of flowers in too rich soil is telling. Women aren't naturally weak or frivolous, they've been deliberately cultivated that way. Their strength sacrificed to ornamental beauty, their potential usefulness withered by a system that values only their appearance. Wollstonecraft was also shaped by her own experience in ways that gave her unique insight into these problems. She hadn't lived a sheltered, comfortable life. Her father was a violent drunk who squandered the family money, and she'd witnessed her mother's suffering in a brutal marriage. She had worked as a lady's companion, essentially a paid friend to a wealthy woman, a position that showed her the emptiness of upper class women's lives. She'd been a governess living in other people's homes, responsible for educating children while having almost no authority or respect. She'd run a school with her sisters, trying to implement progressive educational ideas, only to see how limited women's options were, even when they tried to be independent. She'd written for a living at a time when respectable women weren't supposed to work, moving in radical intellectual circles in London where she met revolutionaries, philosophers, and reformers. All of this experience fed into her book. She wasn't theorizing from a distance. She knew what it meant to be dependent, to have your intellect dismissed, to watch intelligent women trapped in lives that wasted their abilities. She'd seen mothers unable to educate their own children because their own education had been so inadequate. She'd seen wives utterly dependent on husbands with no legal rights and no ability to support themselves. She'd seen the aristocratic women whose only accomplishment was being decorative, and the working class women ground down by poverty and lack of opportunity. Her book wasn't theoretical speculation, it was grounded in lived observation of how the system failed everyone involved. What makes this book radical even today is how Wollstonecraft refuses sentimental arguments. She doesn't claim women are naturally pure or morally superior the way some later feminists would. She doesn't appeal to chivalry or ask men to protect women. She doesn't argue that women's special nature or maternal instinct gives them a different but equal role. Instead, she makes an argument from reason and utility. She says, educate women properly, treat them as rational beings capable of moral agency and society benefits. Keep them ignorant and dependent, and everyone suffers, including men, who end up with companions incapable of intellectual partnership and mothers unprepared to raise virtuous citizens. Children suffer because their mothers cannot properly educate them. Society suffers because half its potential is wasted. And even women's much wanted domestic duties suffer because women haven't been trained to think rationally about household management. This book emerged at a precise historical moment when these arguments could actually be heard, when there was a brief window of genuine revolutionary possibility. The old certainties were crumbling. If monarchy wasn't divinely ordained, if aristocratic privilege wasn't natural law, if common men could be citizens rather than subjects, then why should the subordination of women be any different? The same logic that justified revolution against kings could justify women's emancipation. Wollstonecraft took the logic of the Enlightenment and pushed it to its uncomfortable conclusion that you cannot build a rational, virtuous society on the foundation of half the population's systematic oppression. You cannot preach natural rights while denying them to women. You cannot claim to value reason while deliberately keeping women ignorant. She was writing for an audience of educated men, the politicians and philosophers who were reshaping society. Her tone is simultaneously deferential and confrontational. She acknowledges her own limitations, her lack of formal education, her position as a woman daring to speak on political matters, but she also refuses to be dismissed. She appeals to their rationality, their commitment to consistency, their revolutionary principles. If they truly believe what they claim to believe, they must extend it to women, and anything less is hypocrisy. Now, turning towards the contents of the book, Mary Wollstonecraft doesn't ease into her critique. She opens by diagnosing what she sees as the fundamental sickness in women's condition. They've been systematically trained to be weak, to be vain and intellectually stunted. This isn't an accident of nature, it's the deliberate product of an educational system designed to produce ornamental wives rather than rational human beings. The core problem, as Wollstonecraft sees it, is that women are denied the development of reason, while men are educated to think, to analyze, to form moral judgments based on principle. Women are taught to rely on feelings, instincts, and the opinions of others. They're encouraged to be creatures of sensibility rather than sense, to cultivate emotional responses rather than rational analysis, and this produces exactly the kind of person you'd expect: someone incapable of genuine virtue, dependent on external validation, and unable to be a proper companion, mother, or citizen. She attacks this from the very beginning, refusing to flatter her female readers. In her introduction, she makes clear that she would not treat women as delicate flowers who need protection from harsh truths. She says, "My own sex, I hope, will excuse me if I treat them like rational creatures instead of flattering their fascinating graces and viewing them as if they were in a state of perpetual childhood, unable to stand alone. I earnestly wish to point out in what true dignity and human happiness consists. I wish to persuade women to endeavor to acquire strength both of mind and body, and to convince them that the soft phrases, susceptibility of heart, delicacy of sentiment, and refinement of taste are almost synonymous with epithets of weakness, and that those beings who are only the objects of pity and that kind of love, which has been termed its sister, will soon become objects of contempt." This is a direct assault on the entire vocabulary of femininity. All those qualities praised in women, softness, delicacy, refined sensibility, are actually markers of weakness. When you're only an object of pity and condescending affection, you eventually become an object of contempt. Wollstonecraft is saying women need to wake up to how their supposed privileges are actually chains. The educational system itself comes under withering scrutiny. Instead of learning to think, girls are taught accomplishments, superficial skills designed purely to make them attractive to potential husbands. They learn a bit of music, enough to play simple pieces at parties. They learn some French, enough to seem cultured. They learn to draw, to dance, to dress fashionably, but none of this develops their minds. It's all surface, all performance, and all oriented towards a single goal, which is to catch a husband. Wollstonecraft writes, "Taught from infancy that beauty is woman's sceptre, the mind shapes itself to the body, and roaming round its gilt cage, only seeks to adorn its prison. Men have various employments and pursuits which engage their attention and give a character to the opening mind, but women, confined to one, and having their thoughts constantly directed to the most insignificant part of themselves, seldom extend their views beyond the triumph of the hour." That image of the gilt cage is central to her argument. The cage looks beautiful, decorated with all the privileges and protections supposedly granted to women, but it's still a cage. Women's minds are imprisoned, their thoughts constantly directed towards their bodies, toward their parents, toward the temporary triumph of being admired. Meanwhile, men develop real character through diverse pursuits and meaningful work. The inequality isn't natural, it's produced by completely different modes of education. This brings her to one of her most controversial claims. As things currently stand, women deserve their subordinate position. Not because they're naturally inferior, but because their education has made them actually inferior in their current state. Women really are more frivolous, more vain, more intellectually weak than men, but only because they've been deliberately made that way. She doesn't shy away from describing women's faults. They're obsessed with fashion and gossip. They're manipulative and cunning rather than honest and direct. They are also emotionally volatile, unable to reason calmly about serious matters. They neglect their children's education because they themselves are uneducated. But, and this is crucial, all of this is the predictable result of how they have been raised themselves. The conduct books and educational manuals written for women make everything worse. These texts, mostly written by men, explicitly instruct women to cultivate weakness, to hide any intelligence they might have, to manipulate through charm and tears rather than engage honestly. They teach women that their power lies in their beauty and in managing men through indirect means. Wollstonecraft finds this particularly pernicious because it creates a specific kind of moral corruption. When you have no direct power, no legitimate authority, you learn to get what you want through manipulation. Women become sly, deceitful, and focused on petty domestic tyranny because they're denied any legitimate sphere of action. She says, "Women are told from their infancy and taught by the example of their mothers that a little knowledge of human weakness, justly termed cunning, softness of temper, outward obedience, and a scrupulous attention to a puerile kind of propriety will obtain for them the protection of man, and should they be beautiful, everything else is needless for at least 20 years of their lives. For 20 years, beauty is enough, but what happens after? women are left with nothing. No developed intellect, no genuine moral character, no skills or knowledge that give life meaning. Their husbands, who married them for beauty and charm, find them boring once the novelty wears off. The women themselves, having centered their entire existence on being attractive, face a crisis when their looks inevitably fade. They become bitter, jealous, obsessed with maintaining appearances, or they sink into trivial domesticity with no larger purpose. Now, in Wollstonecraft's view, the consequences of this extend far beyond women's own unhappiness. When women are uneducated, they cannot properly educate their own children. Mothers are children's first teachers, responsible for their early moral and intellectual formation. But how can an ignorant, frivolous woman teach virtue to her children? How can someone who's never learned to reason herself teach her sons or daughters to think? The result is that each generation perpetuates the problem. Wollstonecraft argues, make women rational creatures and free citizens, and they will quickly become good wives and mothers. That is, if men do not neglect the duties of husbands and fathers. Asserting the rights which women in common with men ought to contend for, I have not attempted to extenuate their faults, but to prove them to be the natural consequence of their education and station in society. If so, it is reasonable to suppose that they will change their character and correct their vices and follies when they are allowed to be free in a physical, moral, and civil sense. This is her central claim. Give women genuine education, treat them as rational beings with rights and responsibilities, and they'll become genuinely virtuous. The current system produces the very faults it then uses to justify women's subordination. Women are kept ignorant, which makes them frivolous, which is then cited as evidence that they are naturally inferior and need to be kept ignorant. It's circular reasoning that serves male power. The author also addresses the argument that women's weakness makes them objects of chivalric protection, that men's duty is to shelter and care for delicate women. She finds this argument contemptible. First, because it's not actually true. Most women, especially poor women, receive no such protection and instead face harsh exploitation. Second, because even when protection is offered, it comes at the price of freedom and dignity. Being protected like a child means being treated like a child, incapable of agency or self direction. She'd rather women be free and face the world's difficulties than be protected and infantilized. The physical dimension of education receives significant attention. Women are taught to be physically weak, to avoid exercise, to cultivate a delicate constitution. They are dressed in restrictive clothing that limits movement. They are discouraged from vigorous activity. The result is genuinely poor health, weakness that then gets attributed to female nature rather than female education. Wollstonecraft argues that women should exercise alongside men, should develop physical strength and vitality. A healthy body supports a healthy mind, and the current system weakens both. She also examines how class intersects with gender. Upper class women have it worst in some ways. They are the most thoroughly trapped in the system of ornamental uselessness. They have servants to do everything, no productive work, nothing to do but focus on appearance and social position. Working class women, despite facing grinding poverty, often have more practical skills and mental development because necessity forces them to work and think. But all women are damaged by the denial of genuine education and civic participation. Throughout this section of her argument, Wollstonecraft maintains that she is not arguing from sentiment or asking for special consideration. She is making a rational case based on observable facts. The current system produces bad outcomes for everyone. Men end up with wives who cannot be intellectual companions. Children end up with mothers who cannot educate them properly. Women themselves are miserable, their potential completely wasted. Society loses the contributions of half of its population, and none of this is necessary. It's all the result of choices about education and social organization that could be changed. Her vision of proper education is radical for her time. She wants co-education. She wants boys and girls learning together in national public schools. They should study the same subjects: reading, writing, arithmetic, science, history. They should exercise together. Education should be free and available to all classes, not restricted to the wealthy. The goal should be developing rational, virtuous citizens capable of moral autonomy, not producing ornamental wives or submissive subjects. She writes, to render mankind more virtuous and happier, of course, both sexes must act from the same principle, but how can that be expected when only one is allowed to see the reasonableness of it? To render also the social compact truly equitable, and in order to spread those enlightening principles, which alone can ameliorate the fate of man, women must be allowed to found their virtue on knowledge, which is scarcely possible unless they be educated by the same pursuits as men. Virtue requires understanding why something is virtuous, not just following rules. If women are to be moral agents, they need to understand moral principles rationally. The social compact, the agreement that legitimates political authority, cannot be truly equitable if half the population is excluded from the reasoning that underlies it. This isn't just about fairness to women, it's about building a genuinely rational, virtuous society. The analysis here connects to broader Enlightenment debates about human nature and perfectibility. If humans are shaped by education and environment rather than fixed by nature, then changing education can change human character. The fact that women currently seem intellectually inferior does not tell us anything about their natural capacities. It only tells us about the effects of their education. This is the same logic revolutionaries used to argue against aristocratic privilege. The aristocrat isn't naturally superior to the commoner. He's just been raised with better education and more opportunities. Apply that same logic to gender, and women's apparent inferiority disappears as a justification for their subordination. Wollstonecraft also addresses the fear that educated women will neglect domestic duties. She argues exactly the opposite. Properly educated women will be better wives and mothers, not worse. They'll manage households more rationally, educate children more effectively, be more interesting companions to their husbands. The current system produces women who are bored by domestic life because they have no larger understanding of its purpose, who neglect their children because they're too focused on fashion and social events, who cannot manage money because they've never been taught arithmetic. Real education would make women more capable in every sphere, not less. Having established that women's apparent weakness is the product of education rather than nature, Wollstonecraft turns to the institutions and practices that perpetuate this system. Marriage, as currently constituted, is one of our primary targets. She argues that the institution has been corrupted into a form of legalized prostitution, where women trade beauty and sexual access for economic security. This isn't marriage as a partnership of equals, it's a fundamentally unequal transaction that degrades both parties. The problem begins with how women are prepared for marriage. They're taught that catching a husband is their only goal, that everything depends on making themselves attractive to men during their brief years of youth and beauty. This produces a particular kind of desperation and artificiality. Women learn to perform femininity, to manipulate through charm, to hide any intelligence or strength that might threaten male ego, and once they succeed in marrying, what's then? The foundation of the relationship is superficial attraction, not shared values or intellectual compatibility. She says, the woman who has only been taught to please will soon find that her charms are oblique sunbeams and that they cannot have much effect on her husband's heart when they are seen every day, when the summer is past and gone. Will she then have sufficient native energy to look into herself for comfort and cultivate her dormant faculties? Or is it not more rational to expect that she will try to please other men, and in the emotions raised by the expectation of new conquests, endeavor to forget the mortification her love or pride has received? This passage captures the tragedy of marriages built on nothing but physical attraction. Once that fades, and it inevitably does, the woman has nothing left. She hasn't developed her mind, hasn't cultivated inner resources, has no genuine connection with her husband beyond the initial romantic excitement. So she either sinks into depression and triviality, or she seeks validation through flirtation with other men. Meanwhile, the husband, bored with a wife who can't engage with him intellectually, seeks companionship elsewhere. The marriage becomes an empty shell maintained only by legal and social pressure. The legal structure of marriage makes everything worse. Under English common law, which Wollstonecraft lived under, married women had virtually no legal existence. Upon marriage, a woman's property became her husband's. She had no right to her own earnings, couldn't sign contracts, couldn't sue or be sued independently. Her husband had legal authority over her body, her movements, even her children. And if she left an abusive marriage, she had no claim to her children and by no means of supporting herself. This legal subordination meant that women were entirely dependent on their husband's goodwill, with no recourse if that goodwill disappeared. So she connects this legal subordination to the broader corruption of women's character. When you have no legal rights, no economic independence, no legitimate authority, you're forced to get what you need through indirect means. Women become manipulative because manipulation is their only tool. They focus on managing their husband's moods, on wheeling and coercing, or on using sexual access as leverage. This produces exactly the kind of cunning, petty character that's then used to justify women's exclusion from serious pursuits. The system creates the very faults it claims are natural. She is particularly critical of how the denial of economic independence corrupts women morally. When women cannot support themselves through honorable work, when their only option is dependence on a man, they're forced to see themselves as commodities to be traded. Marriage becomes an economic transaction where women sell themselves to the highest bidder, or at least to whoever will provide security. This makes genuine affection nearly impossible. Women marry for money and status, men marry for beauty and domestic service, and no one's thinking about compatibility, shared values, or intellectual partnership. Wollstonecraft observes, women are supposed to possess more sensibility and even humanity than men, and their strong attachments and instantaneous emotions of compassion are given as proofs. But the clinging affection of ignorance has seldom anything noble in it, and may mostly be resolved into selfishness, as well as the affection of children and brutes. I have known many weak women whose sensibility was entirely engrossed by their husbands, and as for their humanity, it was very faint indeed, or rather, it was only a transient emotion of compassion. This cuts against the sentimental notion that women are naturally more feeling, more compassionate, morally superior in their emotional capacities. Wollstonecraft argues that what passes for feminine sensibility is often just narrow selfishness. Women are attached to their husbands and children not from genuine virtue but from dependence and self interest. Real compassion, real moral feeling requires understanding and reason. The kind of emotional excess cultivated in women isn't virtue, it's a substitute for genuine moral development. The question of virtue is central to Wollstonecraft's entire project. She defines virtue as rational adherence to moral principle, the ability to understand what's right and choose it even when it's difficult. This kind of virtue requires reason, requires the ability to think abstractly about moral questions, requires education and practice in moral reasoning. But women are denied all of this. They are taught to follow rules without understanding them, to obey rather than to judge, to rely on feeling rather than principle. The result is that they're not capable of genuine virtue, only of a kind of conditional obedience that evaporates under pressure. She gives multiple examples of how this plays out. A woman raised to value only her husband's approval will abandon her principles if he disapproves. A woman who's never been taught to think about moral questions rationally cannot guide her children in developing genuine virtue. A woman whose only moral instruction has been about propriety and reputation will be more concerned with appearances than with actual right action. Without reason as the foundation, there is no stable moral character, only shifting conformity to whatever the current situation demands. Wollstonecraft also addresses the argument that women's maternal feelings give them a special moral character, that their natural affection for children makes them inherently virtuous. She rejects this completely. Animal affection isn't virtue. A dog loves its puppies, but that doesn't make the dog virtuous. Human virtue requires reason and choice. Moreover, she argues that mothers who haven't developed their own minds make terrible educators for their children. They spoil them, indulge them, fail to instill discipline or rational principles. They're too emotional, too inconsistent, too focused on immediate affection rather than long term character development. She says, meek wives are, in general, foolish mothers, wanting their children to love them best and take their part in secret against the father who is held up as a scarecrow. When chastisement is necessary, though they have offended the father must inflict the punishment. He must be the judge in all disputes, but I shall more fully discuss this subject when I treat of private education. I now only mean to insist that unless the understanding of woman be enlarged, and her character rendered more firm by being allowed to govern her own conduct, she will never have sufficient sense or command of temper to manage her children properly. This passage reveals how the corruption of women's education damages the next generation. Mothers who lack rational judgment cannot discipline effectively, cannot teach moral principles, undermine their husband's authority to win their children's affection. The children learn manipulation and emotional excess rather than virtue and reason, and the cycle continues. These badly raised children grow up to raise their own children just as badly. The question of women's employment and economic independence receives sustained attention. Wollstonecraft argues that women need the ability to support themselves through honorable work, not just as a backup in case marriage fails, but as essential to human dignity. When your entire survival depends on pleasing someone else, when you have no alternative to marriage, you cannot be free. You are a slave, even if the chains are gilded. She surveys the limited options available to respectable women, governess, companion, running a school, and notes how poorly paid and insecure these positions are. Most women have no choice but marriage, which means they have no leverage in negotiating the terms of that marriage. She is also scathing about the double standard in sexual morality. Men who have affairs before or during marriage face minimal consequences. Women who transgress sexually are utterly ruined, cast out of respectable society, unable to support themselves, often forced into prostitution. This inequality isn't just unfair, it's part of the broader system that keeps women subordinate. The threat of sexual ruin is a form of social control, keeping women obedient and dependent. Meanwhile, men face no such constraint, free to indulge in their desires with minimal consequence. Wollstonecraft connects this to the broader problem of male tyranny. She explicitly compares the position of women to that of subjects under despotic government. Just as political tyranny corrupts both ruler and ruled, making the tyrant vicious and the subject servile, so too does male tyranny over women corrupt both sexes. Men become accustomed to arbitrary power, to having their will obeyed without question, to valuing women only for their usefulness or attractiveness. This makes them worse husbands, worse fathers, worse citizens. Women become sly, manipulative, focused on pleasing rather than on genuine virtue. Both parties are degraded by the relationship. She says, would men but generously snap our chains and be content with rational fellowship instead of slavish obedience, they would find us more observant daughters, more affectionate sisters, more faithful wives, more reasonable mothers, in a word, better citizens. We should then love them with true affection because we should learn to respect ourselves, and the peace of mind of a worthy man would not be interrupted by the idle vanity of his wife, nor the babes sent to nestle in a strange bosom, having never found a home in their mothers. This is her promise. Liberate women, educate them as rational beings, grant them legal and economic independence, and everyone benefits. Men would have genuine companions instead of manipulative dependents, children would have educated, rational mothers, and society would benefit from the contributions of all its members. The current system benefits no one. It corrupts men, degrades women, and perpetuates ignorance and vice across generations. She addresses the fear that equality would destroy sexual difference or domestic harmony. Her response is that genuine difference doesn't require artificial cultivation. If men and women have different natural capacities or inclinations, those will emerge even with equal education. But currently, we cannot know what's natural and what's imposed because women have never been allowed to develop freely. The supposed natural delicacy, emotional excess, and intellectual weakness of women might all be artifacts of their education. give women the same opportunities as men, and then see what differences actually emerge. Wollstonecraft also discusses religion and its role in women's subjection. She argues that true religion, which is rational understanding of moral duty, requires developed reason. The kind of religion women are taught is superstitious, emotional, focused on ritual and feeling rather than genuine moral understanding. They are told to be humble, obedient, submissive, and this is framed as religious virtue. But this is just another tool of subjection. Real religious virtue would require women to think about moral questions, to develop their rational capacities, to be moral agents rather than passive followers. Near the end of her argument, she proposes concrete reforms. Education should be public, national, and co-educational through elementary levels. Girls and boys should study the same subjects, exercise together, develop their minds and bodies together, and this would end the artificial cultivation of weakness and delicacy. After basic education, boys and girls could pursue different paths if their interests or abilities diverged, but they'd have the same foundation of rational education. Women should be allowed to pursue professions, medicine, business, politics. She sees no reason why women couldn't practice medicine, especially in treating other women. Why shouldn't women run businesses, manage property, participate in government? The current system wastes enormous human potential by excluding half the population from productive work. Some women might still choose domestic life, but it should be a choice based on genuine preference, not the only option available. The legal structure of marriage needs reform. Women should retain control of their property, have legal rights as individuals, be able to leave abusive marriages without losing everything, and marriage should be a partnership of equals, not a relationship of master and servant. If marriage is reformed along these lines, it will be stronger, not weaker, based on genuine affection and shared values rather than economic desperation and legal coercion. Throughout all of this, Wollstonecraft maintains that she's not arguing against marriage, domesticity, or sexual difference. She's arguing for genuine virtue, which requires reason, which requires education and liberty. The current system prevents women from being truly virtuous, which harms everyone. Her vision is of a society where both sexes are educated as rational beings, where women can be genuine companions to men rather than either slaves or tyrants, where children are raised by mothers who can actually guide their moral development. She concludes by acknowledging the difficulty of her task. The system she is critiquing is centuries old, embedded in law, custom, religion, and philosophy, and most men benefit from it or think that they do and will resist change. Many women have internalized their subordination so thoroughly that they'll defend the very system that oppresses them. But she insists that reason and justice are on her side. The Enlightenment principles of natural rights, rational autonomy, and human perfectibility, properly understood, lead inevitably to women's emancipation. Those who claim to believe in liberty and equality while denying them to women are hypocrites, applying principles inconsistently to preserve their own privilege. So, this is her fundamental challenge, that there are no separate virtues for men and women. Truth is truth, virtue is virtue for all human beings. The supposedly special feminine virtues, modesty, delicacy, submissiveness, aren't real virtues at all. They are artificial constructions designed to serve male convenience. If society is to be reformed along rational principles, if the revolution in political thought is to be consistent, it must include women as full participants. Anything less is a betrayal of the very principles the revolutionaries claim to uphold.